The setting sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Redemption Creek, painting the weathered buildings in hues of amber and gold. Marshal Elijah Thornton stood on the porch of his office, his weathered face revealing the toll of 20 years upholding the law in Wyoming territory. His eyes, still sharp, despite the crow's feet that framed them, scanned the horizon where storm clouds gathered in the distance. The town had known peace for nearly 2 years now, but Elijah felt a familiar unease settling in his bones, the same sensation he'd experienced before trouble found him in the past. His hand instinctively moved to the worn grip of his Colt Peacemaker, the revolver that had saved his life more times than he cared to remember. "You expecting someone, Marshal?" The voice belonged to Samuel Winters, the town's blacksmith, and one of the few men Elijah considered a true friend in these parts. "Not exactly," Elijah replied, his gaze never leaving the distant horizon. "Just got a feeling is all. I hope you're enjoying this story so far. If you are, please consider subscribing to the channel. I'd love to know, what city are you watching from today?" Samuel nodded knowingly, having learned years ago not to dismiss the marshal's intuitions. "Well, whatever's coming, this town stands behind you. Always has." He clapped a massive hand on Elijah's shoulder before continuing down the street toward his home, where his wife would have supper waiting. Elijah watched him go, grateful for the simple assurance, but knowing that loyalty alone wouldn't stop bullets if what he feared was truly on its way. Inside the office, a telegram lay on his desk, the yellow paper bearing words that had shattered the relative peace of his existence. "Carlton Brothers released. Stop. Heading your way. Stop." 3 men who had sworn to see him dead for sending their youngest brother to the gallows 7 years ago. 3 men who had nothing left to lose. As night fell over Redemption Creek, Elijah made his way to the modest 2-story home on the edge of town. The soft glow of lamplight welcomed him, and despite the weight on his shoulders, he felt a momentary respite, knowing that inside waited the one person who had given his hard life meaning. Catherine Thornton had been the schoolteacher when they met, newly arrived from Boston with ideals as bright as her hazel eyes. Most folks had wagered she wouldn't last a month in the harsh realities of the frontier, but they had underestimated her resilience. 8 years of marriage had only strengthened her spirit, even as life on the frontier had taught her the cost of loving a man who pinned a star to his chest each morning. "You're late," she observed as he hung his hat on the hook by the door. The smell of beef stew filled the small home, but Elijah's appetite had abandoned him hours ago. "Had some things to attend to," he answered, removing his gun belt and placing it within easy reach of his favorite chair. Their eyes met, and he knew immediately that she could see through his attempted nonchalance. Catherine had always possessed an uncanny ability to read him, to see the shadows that darkened his thoughts even when he tried to hide them. "The telegram," she said simply. It wasn't a question. "You're planning to face them alone, aren't you?" Elijah sank into his chair, suddenly feeling every one of his 52 years. "This isn't the town's fight, Katie. It's mine. Has been since I put that rope around Jacob Carlton's neck." He watched as she ladled stew into a bowl, despite knowing he wouldn't eat much of it. Her hands were steady, but he could see the tightness around her mouth, the slight furrow between her brows that appeared whenever she was worried, but trying not to show it. "When do you expect them?" she asked, placing the bowl before him and taking her seat across the table. Outside, the first drops of rain began to tap against the windows, the storm finally reaching town after threatening all afternoon. 2 days, maybe 3 if the weather slows them down. Elijah picked up his spoon more to please her than from any desire to eat. "Katie, I want you to stay with your sister in Cheyenne until this is over. I can telegraph her tomorrow and—" "No." The word was soft but firm, brooking no argument. "My place is here, Elijah. It always has been." The rain fell harder now, drumming against the roof as they sat in silence, neither willing to bend. In the years they had been together, Catherine had never interfered with his duties as marshal, understanding that the badge he wore came with obligations he couldn't ignore. But something in her eyes told him this time would be different. This time she wouldn't simply wait at home while he walked into danger. As lightning flashed outside, illuminating her determined expression, Elijah realized with a mixture of frustration and pride that he had married a woman every bit as stubborn as himself. Morning brought clear skies and the usual bustle of activity to Redemption Creek. Elijah moved through his routine with practiced efficiency, checking in with shopkeepers, settling a minor dispute between ranchers, and maintaining the quiet presence that had kept the peace for so long. But underneath this veneer of normalcy, his mind was working, planning, preparing for the confrontation that loomed on the horizon. He had faced down desperate men before, had stared into the eyes of killers and rustlers who thought themselves beyond the reach of law. But the Carlton brothers were different. They were coming not for profit or out of desperation, but for vengeance, cold and calculated. At the general store, Elijah replenished his ammunition supply while engaging in seemingly casual conversation with Franklin Pierce, the proprietor who had a finger on the pulse of all local gossip. "Heard anything about strangers passing through neighboring towns?" he asked, counting out coins for the boxes of cartridges. Pierce leaned closer across the counter, lowering his voice despite the empty store. "As a matter of fact, Marshal, Joe Miller rode in from Silver Creek this morning. Says 3 rough-looking men spent the night at the saloon there. Asked a lot of questions about our town, and about you specifically." He paused, glancing toward the door before continuing. "The way Joe described them, I'd wager my store they're the Carlton brothers. William, Matthew, and that oldest one. Edgar," Elijah finished, the name tasting bitter on his tongue. Edgar Carlton, the eldest and most dangerous of the brothers, had been rumored to have killed more than a dozen men before Elijah had managed to bring the family to justice. While the others were merely vicious, Edgar possessed a cunning that made him truly dangerous. "How far is Silver Creek by horseback with the trails muddy from the rain?" "Day and a half, maybe less if they push hard," Pierce answered, wrapping the ammunition in brown paper. "You want me to spread the word? Get some of the boys together to help stand against them." Elijah shook his head as he tucked the packages into his coat pockets. "No need to worry, folks, just yet. Could be nothing." But both men knew it wasn't nothing, and as Elijah stepped back onto the street, he noted how the once ordinary day now seemed charged with an electric anticipation, as if the town itself were holding its breath. His next stop was the home of retired Judge Hammond, the man who had presided over Jacob Carlton's trial and pronounced the death sentence. Hammond opened the door at Elijah's knock, his once imposing frame now stooped with age, but his mind remained as sharp as the day he'd hung up his robes. "I was wondering when you'd come by, Marshal," he said, gesturing Elijah inside. "News travels fast, even to old men like me." They settled in the judge's study, surrounded by law books and memories of a time when the territory was even wilder than it was now. "They'll come for me too, I expect," Hammond remarked, pouring 2 glasses of whiskey and sliding one toward Elijah. "The Carlton brothers never struck me as men who would forget who sentenced their brother." "Which is why I'm here," Elijah confirmed, leaving the whiskey untouched. I'd like you to consider leaving town for a spell, Judge. Visit your daughter in Denver, perhaps. Just until this situation resolves itself. The old judge's laugh was dry as prairie grass in August. Run away, you mean? At my age? He shook his head, taking a sip of his drink. No, Marshal. I've lived my whole life by a certain code. I won't abandon it now just because death comes knocking a bit more insistently than usual. He fixed Elijah with a penetrating stare. Besides, if we all flee, what message does that send? That the law bends when threatened? That justice can be intimidated? Elijah couldn't argue with the judge's principles, even as he worried for the old man's safety. As he rose to leave, Hammond grasped his arm with surprising strength. Thornton, I've known you a long time. You're thinking of facing them alone, aren't you? Some misguided notion of nobility or responsibility? It's my badge they're coming for. My actions that set this in motion, Elijah replied. Nonsense, Hammond snapped. It was Jacob Carlton's own actions that set this in motion when he murdered that family. You did your duty, as did I. This town has prospered under the rule of law we established. Don't you dare suggest its people haven't earned the right to defend it. And you. As Elijah stepped back into the sunlight, the judge's words followed him. He had always seen his role as protector of the town. But perhaps Hammond was right. Perhaps in his determination to shield others from danger, he had denied them the chance to stand for something bigger than themselves. It was a troubling thought, one that accompanied him as he continued his rounds, noting with a marshal's eye the possible locations for ambush, the sight lines down the main street, the places where innocent bystanders might be caught in crossfire. The Silver Buckle Saloon hummed with the usual evening activity, piano music competing with the clink of glasses and the murmur of conversation. Catherine Thornton rarely ventured into such establishments, but tonight she moved with purpose through the bat-wing doors, ignoring the momentary hush that fell as patrons recognized the marshal's wife. Madeline Carter, the saloon's owner and madam, spotted her immediately and made her way through the crowd. Mrs. Thornton, she greeted with genuine warmth, despite their vastly different stations in town society. This is an unexpected pleasure. Can I help you with something? I need to speak with you privately, Maddie, Catherine replied, using the familiar name few in town would dare. The two women had an unusual friendship, born from a night years ago when Catherine had tended to one of Maddie's girls who had been beaten by a customer. While the town's other respectable women had shunned the saloon owner, Catherine had seen beyond Madeline's profession to the shrewd, compassionate woman beneath. In the privacy of Maddie's office upstairs, Catherine revealed the reason for her visit. The Carlton brothers are coming, likely by tomorrow. They mean to kill Elijah, and probably Judge Hammond too. Her voice remained steady, though her hands betrayed her anxiety as they twisted the fabric of her skirt. Elijah intends to face them alone. He's too stubborn to ask for help, too determined to protect everyone else. Madeline poured 2 glasses of brandy, handing one to Catherine. Your husband is a good man, but good men often have a misplaced sense of what protecting others means. She sipped her drink thoughtfully. What exactly are you proposing, Catherine? I assume you didn't come just to share your worries. Information, Catherine answered, leaving the brandy untouched. Your girls hear things from customers that no one would ever say to the marshal or his wife. I need to know if anyone in town might be sympathetic to the Carltons, anyone who might help them or warn them of any plans Elijah makes. A slow smile spread across Madeline's painted lips. You're more cunning than people give you credit for, Mrs. Thornton. She moved to her desk, pulling out a small ledger. As it happens, I do keep track of such things. It's good business to know which men in town carry grudges or harbor unsavory connections. She flipped through the pages before stopping. Thomas Welch lost his ranch to the bank last year. Blames the whole town, especially those in authority. He's been drinking heavily and talking bitterly. And there's James Foster at the livery stable. His cousin rode with the Carletons years ago, before they were caught. Catherine committed the names to memory, grateful for Madeline's unexpected alliance. "There's one more thing," she said, her voice lower now. "Elijah doesn't know I'm here, and he wouldn't approve of what I'm about to ask." Madeline leaned forward, intrigued. "I'm listening. If trouble comes, Elijah will need men he can trust at his back, men who aren't afraid to stand against killers like the Carletons." Catherine met the other woman's gaze directly. "I know some of your customers are skilled with weapons and aren't overly concerned with the letter of the law." Understanding dawned on Madeline's face. "You're asking me to arrange protection for your husband? From men he might have arrested in different circumstances?" When Catherine nodded, Madeline laughed softly. My, the school teacher from Boston has learned some frontier pragmatism after all." She considered for a moment before continuing. "There are a few who owe me favors, men who respect your husband's fairness, even if they occasionally find themselves on the wrong side of his jail cell. I can't promise anything, but I'll see what can be arranged." As Catherine prepared to leave, Madeline caught her arm. "He won't thank you for this, you know. Men like your husband, they have certain notions about honor and facing danger." "I'm not concerned with his gratitude," Catherine replied with quiet determination. "Only his survival." The following day dawned with an eerie calm that seemed to blanket Redemption Creek. Word had spread despite Elijah's attempts to minimize the situation, and the usual activity of the town had slowed to a wary watchfulness. Shopkeepers glanced up nervously at every customer's entrance. Women hurried their children home from school, and men gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed tones that quieted whenever the marshal passed by. Elijah felt the weight of their eyes upon him as he made his rounds, checking and rechecking his preparations for what he now believed was inevitable. By midday, he had positioned Deputy Jenkins on the roof of the bank with a rifle and clear instructions to focus on protecting civilians if shooting started. The jail had been fortified, with extra ammunition stored where it could be quickly accessed. Judge Hammond had reluctantly agreed to remain in his home, though he had pointedly mentioned that his shotgun would be close at hand. Only Catherine remained a source of worry. She had been unusually quiet that morning, going about her routine with a determined efficiency that made Elijah suspicious. He knew his wife well enough to recognize when she was planning something. "I don't like leaving you," he said as he prepared to return to his office after a brief lunch at home. The Carletons could arrive any time now. Catherine handed him his hat, her expression unreadable. "I'll be fine. Mrs. Peterson from next door is coming over to help me with mending this afternoon." The lie was so smooth that Elijah might have believed it if not for the slight flush that colored her cheeks. "Catherine," he began, his tone warning. "Whatever you're planning." "I'm not planning anything," she interrupted, meeting his gaze steadily. "I'm simply refusing to sit idly by while you martyr yourself for this town. There's a difference." She reached up to straighten his bandana, a gesture so familiar and domestic that it nearly broke his heart, given what might lie ahead. "You've protected this town and me for years. Perhaps it's time you allowed others to stand with you, not behind you." Before he could argue further, the church bell began to toll, 3 slow, deliberate rings that signaled trouble approaching. Elijah's hand moved to his gun, even as his eyes remained locked with Catherine's. "Stay here," he ordered. knowing even as he said it that she might not obey. "Promise me." Instead of answering, she pulled him close for a fierce, brief kiss. "Come back to me, Elijah Thornton. That's all I ask." He stepped onto the porch just as Samuel Winters came running up the path, his blacksmith's apron still tied around his waist. "3 riders approaching from the east," he reported, breathing heavily, moving slow, like they're in no hurry. "It's them, Marshal. I recognize Edgar Carlton from the wanted posters years back." Elijah nodded, a strange calm settling over him. "Get off the street, Sam. Tell anyone you see to stay inside, away from windows if possible." As the blacksmith hurried to comply, Elijah began walking toward the main street, each step measured and deliberate. Behind him, he heard the door close as Catherine retreated into the house. At least she had listened to that much. Main Street had emptied as if by magic, the usual bustle replaced by an expectant hush. Elijah took position in front of the marshal's office, standing tall despite the urge to seek cover. The Carlton brothers would expect fear or an ambush. He would offer neither. Minutes stretched like hours as he waited, the only sound the distant creak of a shop sign, swinging in the breeze, and the steady beat of his own heart in his ears. They appeared at the far end of the street, 3 riders silhouetted against the afternoon sun, moving unhurriedly as if they had all the time in the world. As they drew closer, Elijah studied them with a lawman's eye. Edgar rode in front, still lean and wolfish after years in prison. His face weathered, but his eyes as cold and calculating as Elijah remembered. Flanking him were his brothers, William, stocky and mean-spirited, and Matthew, the youngest of the 3 remaining Carltons, barely more than a boy when his brother Jacob had been hanged. They halted their horses 30 paces away, spread out across the width of the street in a formation that spoke of experience and planning. For a long moment, nobody spoke, the tension building like the pressure before a thunderstorm breaks. "Marshal Thornton," Edgar finally called, his voice carrying easily in the silence. "Still wearing that badge, I see. Still hiding behind the law." "The Carlton brothers," Elijah responded evenly. "Still blaming others for the consequences of your family's actions, I see." Edgar's thin lips curled into something approximating a smile, though no warmth reached his eyes. "We've come to settle accounts, Marshal. 7 years is a long time to wait, but prison gives a man plenty of opportunity to plan, to remember every detail of his brother's face as the trapdoor opened beneath his feet. "Your brother murdered an innocent family," Elijah replied, his voice hardening. "Children, Carlton. He killed children in their beds for the contents of a cash box. He faced a fair trial and received the sentence the law prescribed." "The law," Edgar spat, his composure cracking slightly. "Your law. This town's law, not ours." His hand hovered near his holster, but he made no move to draw. Not yet. "We thought about burning this whole town to the ground, starting with that courthouse. But then we decided it would be more fitting to take just you. An eye for an eye, Marshal. Biblical justice." From the corner of his eye, Elijah noticed movement, curtains twitching in windows as townspeople watched the confrontation unfold. The barrel of Deputy Jenkins' rifle visible on the bank rooftop. The shadowy figures of men taking positions along the boardwalks on either side of the street. Not everyone had heeded his warning to stay clear. "I'm giving you one chance," Elijah said, his voice carrying to every corner of the suddenly attentive town. "Ride out now. Never return to Redemption Creek. There doesn't need to be more bloodshed. William Carleton laughed, a harsh sound like gravel under a boot heel. Listen to him, Edgar. The marshal thinks he's being generous. His hand strayed to his gun, eager for the violence to begin. Edgar's gaze never wavered from Elijah's face. You took our brother, Thornton. Now we're going to take everything from you. Starting with your life, then that pretty wife of yours. Oh yes, we know all about her. We've been watching this town for days. A cruel smile spread across his face as he saw the flicker of rage in Elijah's eyes. By sunset, she'll be a widow. By midnight, she'll wish she were dead too. The threat against Catherine ignited something primal in Elijah's chest, but years of discipline kept him from drawing prematurely. That's not going to happen, Carleton. No? Edgar's eyes gleamed with malice. And who's going to stop us? You? One old lawman against the three of us? He gestured dismissively at the empty street. Look around you, Marshal. Where's this town you've protected all these years? Where are the grateful citizens standing beside their beloved lawman? They're hiding, Thornton, cowering behind locked doors while you die alone in the dirt. The words had barely left Edgar's mouth when the first door opened. Samuel Winters stepped into the street, a shotgun cradled in his massive arms. He moved to stand slightly behind and to the right of Elijah, his presence solid as an oak tree. A moment later, the saloon's batwing doors swung outward, and three men emerged, not the upstanding citizens one might expect, but hardened frontiersmen with weathered faces and eyes that had seen their share of violence. They spread out along the boardwalk, hands resting casually near their weapons. From the general store came Franklin Pierce, an ancient Navy Colt revolver that had likely seen service in the war between the states, clutched in his trembling but determined hands. The town's doctor appeared next, unarmed, but standing firm in the doorway of his office, a silent statement that he would not hide from whatever was to come. One by one, doors opened, and men stepped forward. Ranchers, shopkeepers, even old Pete, who swept the saloon floors for drinks and normally avoided any kind of conflict. Most surprising of all was the appearance of several men Elijah recognized as troublemakers he'd locked up in the past for brawling or disturbing the peace. They positioned themselves strategically around the edges of the confrontation, their expressions making it clear they stood with the town, with him, against the outside threat. Elijah caught sight of Madeline Carter watching from her upstairs window, a knowing smile on her painted lips, and suddenly Catherine's strange behavior made sense. His wife had been busy indeed. Edgar Carleton's confident smirk faltered as he took in the unexpected show of solidarity. What had been intended as a simple execution was rapidly transforming into a much more complicated proposition. "This doesn't concern any of you," he called out, addressing the gathering crowd. "Our quarrel is with the marshal alone." "That's where you're wrong," Samuel replied, his deep voice carrying easily. "Marshal Thornton doesn't stand alone in Redemption Creek, never has." A new voice entered the fray, one that froze Elijah's blood. "My husband is the law in this town, Mr. Carleton, but I am its heart." Catherine was walking calmly down the center of the street, a Winchester rifle held comfortably in her hands. She stopped at Elijah's side, ignoring his look of mingled fury and fear. "And both the law and the heart of Redemption Creek reject your vengeance." Edgar's face darkened with rage at this further complication. "This is touching, truly," he snarled, "but it changes nothing. You've just given us more targets." Edgar, Matthew Carleton spoke for the first time, his voice betraying uncertainty as he surveyed the increasingly lopsided confrontation. There's too many of them now. Shut up, Edgar hissed without taking his eyes off Elijah and Catherine. We came here for justice, and we're not leaving without it. Elijah stepped slightly forward, placing himself between Catherine and the Carleton brothers. You didn't come for justice, Edgar. You came for blood. There's a difference. He could feel the situation balancing on a knife's edge. The Carletons were cornered, and cornered men were at their most dangerous. It's over. Surrender your weapons and face the law properly. For a heartbeat, it seemed Edgar might actually consider the offer. Then his face contorted with hatred. Let them kill me, he snarled to his brothers, his hand dropping to his holstered revolver. Not while my heart still beats for you. Catherine whispered to Elijah, raising her rifle in a smooth motion that spoke of practice Elijah had known nothing about. What followed was a chaotic eruption of gunfire and shouting. Edgar drew first, his shot going wide, as Elijah pushed Catherine aside and returned fire in the same motion. William Carleton managed to get off 2 wild shots before Samuel's shotgun roared, the blast catching him squarely in the chest and throwing him from his horse. Matthew, perhaps the wisest of the 3, raised his hands immediately, but not before a bullet from somewhere among the town defenders grazed his arm. Edgar, hit twice, but still upright in his saddle, spurred his horse forward in a desperate charge directly at Elijah and Catherine. Time seemed to slow as the marshal emptied his revolver, each shot finding its mark, yet somehow failing to stop the determined outlaw. As Edgar raised his gun for what would surely be a fatal shot, a single rifle report cracked across the street. Deputy Jenkins on the bank roof, his aim true. Edgar Carleton toppled from his horse, dead before he hit the dust of Redemption Creek's main street. The silence that followed was deafening. Matthew Carleton remained frozen, hands raised, his expression a mixture of shock and relief that his own life had been spared. Slowly, Elijah holstered his empty revolver and turned to Catherine, who stood with her rifle still at the ready, her face pale but composed. "You promised to stay inside," he said quietly, the words containing a universe of emotion, fear, relief, pride, and a hint of exasperation. Catherine lowered the Winchester at last, her eyes never leaving his. "No," she corrected gently. "I didn't promise that at all." The setting sun cast long shadows across the freshly dug graves on the hill overlooking Redemption Creek. 2 simple wooden crosses marked the final resting places of Edgar and William Carleton, while their younger brother Matthew awaited transfer to the territorial prison. The town had begun to settle back into its routines, though the excitement of the shootout would provide fodder for stories told around fires and in the saloon for years to come. Elijah stood alone by the graves, his hat in his hands, lost in thought as the day's events replayed in his mind. He didn't turn at the sound of approaching footsteps, recognizing Catherine's tread even before she slipped her hand into his. "Judge Hammond is hosting a gathering at his home," she said after a moment of shared silence, "to thank everyone who stood with us today." Elijah nodded, his gaze still fixed on the Marcus. "I've been a lawman for over half my life, Katie. Seen men die, put men in the ground myself when necessary. Never gets easier." "Nor should it," she replied softly. "That's what separates men like you from men like them." She gestured toward the graves. "You never forgot the weight of taking a life, even when it's necessary." He finally turned to look at her, studying the face that had become as essential to him as breathing. You organized the town's defense, he stated rather than asked. Got Maddie's men involved, armed yourself, directly disobeyed my instructions to stay safe. A smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. Yes, yes, and most definitely yes. Could have gotten yourself killed, he continued, though there was no real anger in his voice now, only a lingering fear at how close he had come to losing her. So could you, she countered, her grip on his hand tightening. Which is precisely why I refuse to stand aside. I meant what I said to Edgar Carlton, Elijah. You are the law in Redemption Creek, fair, steady, incorruptible. But this town is more than just its laws. It's a community of people who have built lives here, who depend on each other, who depend on you. Her free hand reached up to touch his face, tracing the lines that years of sun and worry had etched there. When I said I was the heart of this town, I meant that I love it as I love you, completely and without reservation. And the heart cannot stand idle while what it loves most is threatened. Elijah covered her hand with his own, turning to press a kiss against her palm. I've spent so long trying to protect you from the dangers of my life that I never fully appreciated how capable you are of facing those dangers alongside me. He looked down at the town below, the windows beginning to glow with lamplight as evening deepened. I never expected them all to stand with me either. After all these years, I still underestimated this place. Perhaps it's time to stop underestimating both your wife and your town, Marshall Thornton, Catherine suggested, a hint of teasing in her voice. As they began the walk back down the hill toward the waiting celebration, Elijah felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. The Carlton brothers had come seeking vengeance, expecting to find a lone lawman defending an ungrateful town. Instead, they had discovered the true strength of Redemption Creek, not in its marshal's gun, but in the bonds that held its people together, in their willingness to stand for what was right, even when facing danger. And most of all, in the fierce, unexpected courage of a schoolteacher from Boston who had found her home on the frontier. The last light of day gilded Catherine's profile as she walked beside him, and Elijah was struck anew by the journey they had taken together. I don't deserve you, he said quietly. Catherine's laugh was warm as she tucked her arm through his. Perhaps not, she agreed with mock seriousness, but you're stuck with me all the same, Elijah Thornton, for as long as my heart beats for you. As they reached the bottom of the hill, the sounds of the town welcoming them home, Elijah found himself surprisingly at peace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, as each day on the frontier inevitably did. But whatever came, he would no longer face it alone. He would face it with Catherine at his side, and the people of Redemption Creek at his back. In the unforgiving landscape of the Wyoming Territory, he had found not just a place to uphold the law, but a place to belong. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.